start going down. So there's kind of a few different parts to what we call Ethereum 2.0, which and when I say Ethereum 2.0, like I generally refer more to kind of base layer changes that will happen to the Ethereum protocol. So including things like proof of stake, including sharding, including like protocol level efficiency upgrades. But what this does not include is all of the work in kind of privacy preserving solutions, state channels, plasma, like all of which by themselves are very valuable, and many of which I actually think will be ready even before any of this comes, maybe even has a test net, right? So to start off, proof of stake, right? So this is kind of the consensus algorithm, the alternative to proof of work. So for if anyone wants, like, one of the kind of nice things about the Ethereum community, as like I mentioned, is that like basically all of our research, like once it's kind of gets anywhere close to being kind of stable enough to be worth talking about, is basically available somewhere online, right? So like most of these slides will have these links at the bottom, and feel free to take pictures and then like painstakingly type the 30 letters into your web browser by hand. Sorry about being too lazy to use Bitly or whatever. This is the kind of Casper and sharding chain 2.1 spec. So this is the latest version of the spec for the kind of Ethereum chain that is based off of pure proof of stake. So before Casper FFG was kind of hybrid proof of work, hybrid proof of stake. And earlier this year, we made this kind of pivotal decision that I think like some people don't like because it really delayed the launch. But like I think in the long term it was the right thing to do, because like in the long term, and like after 1 year, it really does reduce the amount of kind of effort duplication that we have to do. Which basically is that instead of taking a hybrid proof of work, proof of stake approach, we just separately make a proof of stake chain, and you kind of launch the proof of stake chain, and the proof of stake chain kind of has this one-way connection to a proof of work chain, but otherwise it's fairly independent, right? So this is uses a combination of kind of PBFT inspired proof of stake basically the same kind of philosophy as Casper FFG, but with some kind of efficiency improvements, combines it together with kind of Ghost as a fork choice rule, and this gives some nice kind of properties that we'll talk about later, but basically this is kind of highly optimized and like highly efficient proof of stake, still with a kind of very high, like very decentralized, very high validator count. The plan to support like potentially 1 million validators. And if anyone wants to kind of read through the spec, it's basically here. There is an implementation of this in Python, I think, at like GitHub Ethereum beacon chain. And it is pretty far along, right? So this is basically a kind of standalone proof of stake design, and if you want, you could even just build a blockchain out of it, or you could use this to secure a private chain, along with a bunch of other things. One of the kind of important scalability technologies that was used here is aggregate ELS signatures, which basically allows you to take a large number of signatures from a large number of validators and kind of combine them together, so that for every kind of additional validator whose signature he needs to process, the additional space requirements are only 1 bit, and the additional time requirements are maybe 1 over 1,000, like 1 elliptic curve addition, so maybe 1 over 1,000 of a standard signature. So it becomes like a very efficient way to handle thousands of validators, right? So this is one thing. There is also a kind of version of the spec, which is, I mean, it's also a draft, but it's kind of designed for kind of something closer to academic audiences, where basically, instead of talking about like serialization formats and very fine-grained details, we just describe it more in terms of kind of mathematical properties, keep it very compact, and kind of be more explicit about what the security claims are. So Ghost fork choice rule. So basically, the Ghost Fortress rule was kind of originally invented for proof of work by Aviv Zohar and Yonatan Sampolinski in 2013. And the problem that Ghost was meant to solve originally is this problem of basically if network latency is like very large compared to the block time, then how do you ensure the blockchain continues to be secure, right? Or alternatively, you can say, how do we make blockchain secure with a 2-second block time? So here we are using it in part to increase security under network latency, but also in part to kind of make the blockchain much less dependent on proposers. So the school of kind of BFT inspired, the category of BFT inspired proof of stake algorithms that we're using here, right? It does depend fairly heavily on proposers. So it depends on the idea that you have a round. During each round, there's one validator that's supposed to make a block. And the problem basically is that how do you deal with situations where, say, you get unlucky and 20 validators in a row, or 20 proposers in a row are all malicious, right? How do you prevent that from turning into a situation where 20 blocks can get reverted? And Ghost actually does that, right? So one of the benefits of this is that the Ethereum chain can have a fairly high guarantee of security, even in without needing to kind of fully depend on randomness beacons, VDFs, VRFs, elliptic curve, verifiable secret sharing, blah blah blah, right? Basically, this system is secure even if the attacker chooses all the random numbers. And now, if you have a working random number generator, the security guarantees go up, but it was important to me to be able to kind of prove at least some security claim even without relying on randomness, right? So that basically simplifies the security model in many ways. And this is an actual kind of simulation. So if you go to GitHub Ethereum research and then go into the clock disparity folder, you can actually run a Python file and it'll actually kind of do a simulation. And in this simulation, the network latency was, I believe, about 3 times larger than the block time, right? So this is the equivalent of Ethereum running with a network latency of 42 seconds, which in proof of work right now would completely fail, but here it does fine. So properties of the proof of stake, right? So first of all, assuming a synchronous network, so assuming a network latency of less than maybe 5 to 8 seconds, and assuming maybe less than 40% of faulty nodes, the chain kind of almost never reverts even a single block. So 1 confirmation is basically equivalent to 6 confirmations in Bitcoin, or 10 confirmations in Ethereum, or any of these numbers, right? So basically 16 seconds and you already get very high degree of safety. Assuming less than 1/3 faulty, the chain never reverts finalized blocks, right? So this is the kind of PBFT style finality, which basically says that reverting finalized blocks is even more expensive. Plausible liveness. So this is a kind of formal claim that says that the kind of the rules of the chain ensure that the chain can't get stuck. So there's always some way to make progress, right? So if you want to understand why plausible liveness is important, I would encourage reading the Casper FFG paper, but no, we haven't. Like client friendliness, and also kind of supporting validator rotation, so the ability of validators to kind of enter and leave the system. Like clients, so basically one of the nice kind of side effects of BLS aggregation is that you can basically reduce the amount of space needed by a light client. And one of the reasons why we kind of abandoned the old hybrid proof of stake and went to the full version is that when you do the math, the amount of data that a kind of cool light client needs to download in the original version every 20 minutes was 227 megabytes, which is actually not very light. And we basically reduced it to somewhere between 3 and 100 kilobytes, depending on what security guarantee you want. So verifiable delay functions, so we are basically planning on adding a kind of built-in randomness beacon into the chain. And this will be useful both for kind of enhancing the security of the proof of stake. So for example, like the kind of synchronous security guarantee with a VDF, like if the VDF does not work, it might be somewhere maybe around 30%, but if the VDF does work, it could go up to like more than 40%, maybe close to 45, right? So the idea basically is that it's a kind of a function that allows you to kind of commit to a number, and then where nobody knows what the number is that you've committed to until some amount of time passes, and in some amount of time, anyone can calculate the result, right? So this is also useful, aside from the blockchain, we're also doing this because it's very useful for a fairly large class of on-chain applications. So including, like there's many kinds of games that need random numbers. There's, in many cases, like you actually want protocols that have random numbers. So for example, you can increase the efficiency of zero-knowledge proof protocols, you can increase the efficiency of like crypto-economic protocols, a bunch of things. So Justin Drake has been doing a lot of good work working on this full time, and there's been a huge amount of constructions just in the last 3 months alone. So those are kind of some of the improvements on the proof of stake side. And if you want, like, I have a section at the end where we'll talk a bit about development, but there has been a lot of development happening. Sharding, right? So in general, the sharding design basically the sharding design is that you kind of break up the blockchain into a kind of constant number of partitions. So in this case, we have 1,024. And instead of requiring everyone to kind of process and validate everything, we randomly assign subsets of validators to act as a kind of code committee to vote on kind of block hashes of blocks and shards. Right, so basically you just have random committees that specialize in validating one particular subset of the data, then they validate it, and then they make a signature to attest to it, and the signatures get aggregated and published onto chain. And then if 2/3 of a committee approves of a block hash, then it gets included. All right, so the idea basically is that because we're using this random sampling technique, unless an attacker takes over more than maybe 40% of the entire validator pool, there is no way the attacker can take over even one committee. Right? So this is a kind of simulation that I did actually, I think around 5 months ago. But basically this kind of shows how you have the main chain, which is in blue, and you have a bunch of shard chains. And the shard chains are effectively kind of dependent on the main chain, right? But the shard chains also have their own fork choice rule. They have these kind of links going into the main chain, which are in green. So you basically have 1,024 chains that are kind of proceeding in parallel. And when the shard blocks get into the main chain, that also serves as a kind of coordination point, which allows messages from one shard to kind of get into other shards. So one of the kind of big problems in sharding is this kind of data availability problem. And the data availability problem basically says, if you have a block proposer that proposes a block, but then some of the data in the block was not actually even published, then your problem is you can't really prove to other nodes in the network that data does not exist, right? If a block is incorrect, then you can make a fraud proof. You can kind of show them the tiny part of the block that had a mistake in it. If part of a block was not published, you cannot prove to someone else that the data is not published because, like, you could claim that it's not published, but then if you make a claim, then the data could get published after, right? So there's no way to kind of distinguish between like bad block publishers and false claims. So one of the, there has been kind of a lot of research on this. I'm working with some researchers in the UK on a paper that uses erasure coding to do a data availability checking, which hopefully should be published fairly soon. But aside from that, another kind of short-term strategy that we have is this idea of what we call proofs of custody. So a proof of custody is basically a kind of claim that it's a computation that every one of the validators that votes for a block needs to make. And when they make this computation, they basically need to kind of commit or like sign one extra bit. And this one extra bit, like generally there's a 50% chance it's a 1 or there's a 50% chance it's a 0. And then after 1 month, they would need to kind of publish the private seed that they used to make the computation. And then after they publish this seed, anyone else can check their computation, and anyone else can basically, like, if they check the computation wrong, they can play this kind of on-chain challenging game, and they can kind of prove to the network that this node did this computation wrong, and that node can get penalized. So, like, basically it creates this guarantee that if you vote, like, voting on data without checking that it's available is very, very risky, right? And if you vote on data, if you vote that some block is there when actually the block is unavailable, or without even downloading it yourself, then you can't do this computation. And so, like, basically, it ends, like, you run the risk of losing a lot of money, right? So it also creates a kind of lower bound on the amount of money that nodes, the validators need to lose in order to, for a kind of bad block to get accepted by the chain. State execution. So state execution basically means kind of how are transactions processed, right? And yes, I know the word state and execution mean different things. But like in the context of the blockchain, right? Like the state basically is kind of the set of data that like all nodes in the blockchain need to keep track of. So this could include balances, this could include smart contract code, this could include like smart contract temporary storage, like basically things that are kind of not part of the history, things that kind of actually matter in the present, right? And execution basically means like executing the virtual machine, processing transactions. So there's kind of different parts of the state execution engine that we're operating, right? So EWASM is a project that has been running for the last, probably the last 2 years. And the idea is to replace the current Ethereum virtual machine with a new virtual machine that is based on WebAssembly, right? So EWASM maintains guarantees of kind of determinism. So the computation is guaranteed to have the same result every time. Metering, so basically kind of measuring how much gas a transaction consumes. Small code size, security, and simplicity. The EWASM spec is kind of very simple. Like about is probably simpler than the current EVM. EWASM is much faster than the EVM, especially for complex computations. So for example, for implementing cryptographic operations on top of Ethereum, the EWASM is much more kind of effective. And there is a testnet for a kind of version of Ethereum that replaces the EVM with EWASM coming very soon. So this is one part of it, right? So basically, instead of using the EVM for transaction execution, using EWASM. Asynchronous cross-shard transactions. So this is something that we've kind of known about for the last 2 years, but this is basically how to kind of send Ether from one shard to another shard, right? But basically, you start off by making a transaction on one shard, then you kind of create this Merkle branch, you create a receipt for it, then as soon as the other shard becomes aware of the Merkle root of the first shard, you can basically kind of publish the proof that the transaction existed in the first shard into the second shard. So you basically delete 100 coins on the left, then prove to the right that you deleted 100 coins, and then on the right that allows you to kind of create 100 coins, right? So this is basically kind of the same as it has always been. Now we have been thinking about kind of designs to allow for synchronous cross-shard transactions, but the current kind of approach is probably to do that more at layer 2 than at layer 1. But this is something that I think you can probably look up on ETH research as well. Economics. So I mentioned before that I wrote this paper recently on resource pricing in blockchains. And two of the two kind of core sort of prescriptions that I have in that paper, one of them is this adjusting min-fee gas price market. So this basically is a way to make the market for transaction fees more efficient and to make transaction fees less volatile in the short term. And I have some proofs for why kind of that this is kind of optimal and welfare improving and like good in all of the kind of economic technocratic ways. Another thing that I propose that we have been talking about for a long time is a storage maintenance piece. So basically, if you have storage, then, or if you have a smart contract, and that smart contract is storing data in the state, then you don't just pay for it once, you basically have to keep on paying for it for as long as it's part of the state. And this is there to kind of encourage people to conserve state more, to encourage people to clean up, and to ensure that contracts that nobody cares about eventually get deleted. Development. So what I talked about here before was kind of mostly more on the theory side. So kind of ideas in terms of protocol design that have kind of matured quite a lot and gotten from kind of very abstract ideas to something that can be kind of implemented very concretely. But then the next question is, who is actually building it? So there is this article on Medium, which is actually written by someone who is not even part of the Ethereum Foundation. So this kind of shows like how kind of decentralized the Ethereum community's development is, right? That a very large portion of the Ethereum 2.0 work is being done outside of the foundation. And Rocket Pool is basically a company that will be doing staking pools on top of Ethereum 2.0. So who's building it? So this is kind of one way of seeing kind of what a kind of diagram view of what Ethereum looks like, right? Where you have the protocol specification, and the protocol specification is kind of being developed kind of, fairly centrally by kind of a fairly small group of researchers, but it's getting input from a kind of fairly large number of places. On top of that, you have client implementations. And Geth, Parity, Aleph, Trinity, and Harmony are kind of the 5 big implementations of Ethereum 1.0, but then there's also many implementations of Ethereum 2.0 as well, right? So there's one made in Python, there's one by a company called Prismatic Labs made in Go, there's one called Lighthouse made in Rust, I believe there's one made by Consensus, and then there's might be one or two made by other companies. So it is a kind of multi-client ecosystem right from the start, right? And for 2.0, kind of the Ethereum Foundation also made this decision that the kind of quote reference clients that we're building is, in some sense, one that's kind of designed to lose in the actual market. So basically the Python client, right? And the Python client is great, but Python is kind of inherently a fairly slow language, right? And so you would just expect there to be like people that want something faster and something that's kind of closer to optimal. And the goal is that like the client developed by the Ethereum Foundation is meant to kind of serve as a kind of educational tool, as a way for people to learn, as a way for people to like also use and interact with the network, but it's not it's deliberately intended not to become a kind of monopoly winning client that everyone uses, right? Because we believe that kind of single client hegemony kind of ecosystems are not healthy. And so, you have Prismatic, we have Lighthouse, and all of these different groups that are all developing clients by themselves too. So this is from a tweet that was made by, I believe, the CEO of Prismatic Labs about a couple of weeks ago. And basically, they have an implementation of the proof of stake beacon chain that's like, it's in terms of like protocol implementation, it's basically ready, right? So in terms of protocol implementation, like there are multiple implementations now that are 90% ready. The thing that is probably less ready is testing, peer-to-peer networking, the fork choice rule, how clients talk to each other, building a test network, and kind of more of these logistical details like that. And these are things that kind of the different clients are very actively working on right now. Okay? So things that are still left. Number one, kind of 100% finalizing the spec. So right now the spec is maybe 80% finalized, but there's still 20% that's kind of left to go. And to be honest, we're not kind of really hurrying on it very fast. Basically the reason is that, like, number one, it's good to have more time to think, but also number two, like there's still so much more that needs to be done on the development side than on the research. So most of what has not yet been done is basically slashing conditions, right? Basically, like the rules for penalizing validators that misbehave. Formal verification. Formal verification of the mini-spec is in progress, but not yet completed. More development, so development of most all of these different implementations. A testnet, and obviously just tests in general. We're starting to kind of develop a cross-client testing suite, so a testing suite that anyone building a client can kind of check their clients against. And that's something that will hopefully kind of get all of the clients to kind of comply with and talk to each other more easily. Security audits of the code. So like at this point, the code is not even mature enough to security audit, but it will be fairly soon. And after all of this, release, right? So this is basically what the kind of roadmap for at least like Casper and Chardon looks like at this point. In general, I would probably say that Chardon or Casper is still kind of very significantly ahead of Chardon, and part of the reason is that there are kind of parts, like Casper is a dependency of sharding, so you basically can't have the sharding system without the Casper system being in place. Part of it is that the needs of sharding are kind of fundamentally more complex, so the peer-to-peer network is probably a very big piece. Part of it is also that just sharding kind of adds more complexity. So realistically, Casper will kind of be ready for use before sharding is, but like at this point, like I personally would actually think that sharding is like at least conceptually probably surprisingly kind of simpler than a lot of people think. So it is honestly, and it will get there. So thank you, and more questions.